All right, history fans, welcome to another exciting edition of our course. And here today, we're going to turn our attention to the next time period under review in American history. In our most recent lecture, we examined the Reconstruction period, the period from 1865 to 1877. In this lecture, we're going to zoom ahead in time to the late 1870s through the early 1890s, the next time period under review in the class, a period known as the Gilded Age, and we'll explain later in this lecture why it's known as the Gilded Age. In this lecture, we'll examine this period that follows Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, and our goal in this lecture is to understand the abiding, overarching characteristics of the Gilded Age, what defines this period in American history. We begin that process with perhaps the most important element of the Gilded Age, and that concerns economic trends in this period. In the Gilded Age, in this period that spans from the late 1870s through the early 1890s, America fully industrializes. This is a period where America undergoes the second phase of industrialization. In the early 19th century, in the early 1800s, industrialization is largely confined to northern states. The Civil War, in many ways, was a clash between two different labor systems, slave labor in the South and wage labor in the North, because in northern states, prior to the Civil War, wage labor became the rule, as more and more Americans in that part of the country transitioned to an industrial-based economy where people lived in cities and worked in factories. Civil War ends slavery, and that meant that after the Civil War, wage labor would be the sole labor system in America, and as a result, the parts of the country that had yet to industrialize, the South, the West, would go through a period of rapid industrialization as industrialization became the rule in America in the late 19th century here in the Gilded Age period. So one of the key aspects of the Gilded Age is this period of rapid transition towards industrialization, where the nation transitions now to a fully realized industrial economy. In 1800, most of America lived in rural areas and were employed in farming. In 1900, when that century ends, most Americans live in cities and work in factories. So the Gilded Age really accelerates that process that began in northern states prior to the Civil War and now extrapolates it across the whole of the nation, north, south, east, and west, as America rapidly transitions into this industrialized economy, making for a fundamental transformation in not just the economy, but American life, American society as well. So you have the expansion of industrialization, an economy centered on people living in cities, working in factories, mass producing manufactured goods. You had industrialization in the West with industries like mining, ranching, railroad construction, binding the West to markets in the Midwest and the East. This is a period of rapid transition with industrialization and the integration of different hubs around the nation through forms of transportation and communication, the great expansion of railroads, the expansion of telegraph and eventually telephones by the end of the Gilded Age. So in addition to being a period where the American economy is transitioning from farming to factories, from agriculture to industry, it's a period where the American economy becomes braided together through forms of communication and transportation. It's a period where, for the first time now, goods, people, and ideas can circulate from New York to Chicago to San Francisco, where the nation is bound together as a collective marketplace for goods, ideas, as well as representations. It's really this period where a national economy develops, where the nation is bound together through lines of communication, transportation, railroads, telegraphs. We'll talk soon in many lectures to come about the emergence of a national media for the first time in this period, where people from New York to Chicago to San Francisco can all read the same newspaper stories. So it really is a period of integration into this industrial economy. It's a period where mechanisms like transportation, railroads, steamboats, communication, telegraphs, newspapers, telephones really bind together the nation as a marketplace of goods and ideas. It's a period where national brands emerge for the first period, where people across the nation are drinking Coca-Cola, wearing Levi's, drinking Folgers coffee. So for the first time, national brands emerge as part of this process of industrialization, of a national marketplace for goods. Overall, this is a period where industrialization grows, and you have the emergence of what we may describe and identify as big business, where now corporations have holdings and operations throughout the nation. Rather than located in fixed areas, you had companies like U.S. Steel, Standard Oil, that own property around the nation, that conduct business across the whole of the nation and eventually around the world. So this is a period where the American economy rapidly industrializes, where parts of the nation that had hitherto not been touched by industrialization are now folded into that new economy. It's a period where emblems of modernity emerge: skyscrapers, telephones, eventually automobiles. It's a period where a national economy develops for goods, people, ideas. Labor circulates in ways never seen before, as people born in one area may uproot and head to another part of the country, seeking greater economic opportunity, so greater mobility along with the other developments in this period. So in the 1870s, 1880s, and early 1890s, the period that follows the Civil War, Reconstruction, as America emerges after those crises, is this period of the Gilded Age, and one of its key abiding elements are these transformations in the economy, in society, more Americans living in cities, more Americans working in factories, wage labor now the rule across the whole of the nation. New networks of communication, transportation, binding the nation together as a collective body of receivers of manufactured goods, as a national marketplace emerges, new ideas and images circulating, infecting, influencing in ways never possible before. Big business emerges, massive corporations with holdings and dealings across the nation. That is a key hallmark of this Gilded Age. Now, it's one thing to talk about industrial change on that macro level, as we did in the first slide, talking about big macro trends, the transition from agriculture to industry, talk about big developments like the creation of a national railroad system and new inventions that change American life. That's one way of understanding this period and the way in which industrialization, industrial change is at the heart of the Gilded Age. But history is about human beings. And so let's spend some time on this slide talking about how that industrialization, that industrial change we enunciated on the first slide in macro trends affected people as human beings in their daily lives, in their intimate lives. Let's give a few examples of how industrial change affected people on the intimate human level, because history is ultimately not about big macro trends, it's about human beings. Now, we in the 21st century have lived through a period of rapid change and rapid technological change that's very comparable, very analogous to the Gilded Age. And when the history of this period, the history of the early 21st century is written 50, 100 years from now, certainly a historian could attempt to communicate this period by talking about numbers of laptops produced, the changes that came in the economy with the rise of a service sector industry, a so-called information age. But you have experienced those trends in the economy and in technology on the intimate human level. You're much more understanding of those trends in the way in which they affect you in your daily lives, as we spend so much time staring at our smartphones and barking into our smart speakers. So the computer revolution that we've all lived through in the last few decades, the major change in the American economy, as we've seen the decline of industry, the industrialization, and the rise of a service sector post-industrial information age economy, has mostly affected you, the human being living through that period, on the intimate human level, in your daily interactions, your experience with technology on that intimate personal level. I mean, it is called a personal computer. And of course, certainly for us, now the internet is a personal space for us to engage with. There used to be this very popular website called MySpace. Now it's a punchline or joke, as it's been eclipsed by Facebook and Instagram and the like, but the name is very, very revealing. This is your space on the internet. It's very personal. In the Gilded Age, people experienced massive technological, economic change as well on the intimate human level. Let's give some examples of that. Gustavus Swift was an immigrant who came to America in the 19th century and made his mark on American economics, American society and culture in the industrialization of meat. He pioneered the modern means of mass producing and selling meat. Gustavus Swift centered his operations in Chicago, which was at the heart, the hub of the American industrial economy, right there in the center of the nation, with railroad lines emanating out. Chicago has many nicknames: the Windy City, the Second City, the City of Big Shoulders, but in this period of the Gilded Age, one of its nicknames was Porkopolis, because of all the little piggy wiggies who went to their doom there in the stockyards of Chicago. Gustavus Swift was part of establishing Chicago as a center for meat packing, and here he is industrializing the mass production of this commodity, ready-made, ready-to-consume meat. He pioneered the use of a network of ice-cooled railroad cars connected to a network of ice-cooled warehouses around the country, and from that center in Chicago, he could send out pork chops, hot dogs, sausages all around the nation and outcompete local butchers using economies of scale, using new efficiencies, using new forms of transportation. He could outcompete local butchers and offer meat at a much cheaper price for Americans. So this is really a good example of how industrialization, the emergence of a national economy, new forms of transportation, affected people on the intimate human level. You don't get more intimate than putting something in your mouth. And Gustavus Swift changed the way Americans ate. Because of his efforts and his utilization of these new means of production, using economies of scale, he could outcompete local butchers. It's much like the case where Walmart can come into a town and outsell mom and pop operations using their efficiencies, using their forms of modern communication and transportation. Gustavus Swift changed the way Americans ate, using this network of ice-cooled railroad cars, eventually self-refrigerated, connected to a network of ice-cooled warehouses around the nation, using mass production of meat here. He could outcompete local butchers, sell meat cheaper than ever before, and what this meant was more and more Americans for the first time could afford to eat meat. Prior to the efforts of Gustavus Swift here in the Gilded Age, but prior to the industrialization of meat, meat was expensive. Only the wealthiest Americans could consume meat at every meal or every day. But thanks to the efforts of Gustavus Swift, he brought meat to the masses and literally now gave people a taste of a life that had been previously outside their grasps. So this changed the way Americans ate. It ushered in the American diet we recognize today, where we are not content with eating just one dead animal. We need 2 or 3 other dead animals stacked on top as we eat our bacon pastrami disaster burgers. So you could thank Gustavus Swift for creating that American diet that in many ways prevails to this day. His story is a story of industrialization. It's a story of factory production of meat. It's a story of railroads and cities, in this case Chicago. It's a story of all those trends we saw on the previous slide: industrialization, urbanization, the transportation revolution. But it is a story of how those trends affected people on the intimate human level. Just like today, in the 21st century, Americans in the Gilded Age experienced these big macro trends in the economy, in technology, in their intimate daily lives. Another example of this, James Duke, who invented a machine that could mass produce cigarettes. He invented a machine that could cut, roll, and paste 100,000 cigarettes an hour. So Duke did for tobacco what Swift did for meat. He mass-produced a product in factories, put that product on railroads, shipped it around the nation, offered people a ready-made product. Prior to the invention of Duke's method of mass production of cigarettes, his inventions that could cut, roll, and paste cigarettes in this way, if you wanted to smoke a cigarette, you had to buy tobacco from a local tobacconist, and then every time you wanted to take a puff, you had to yourself roll your own cigarettes. Now, today they still sell those papers for people who like to roll their own tobacco cigarettes. Of course, that's why they sell those papers at 7-Eleven and the like. But prior to James Duke, you had to do that labor yourself. But with James Duke's efforts now, he had done that labor for you, mass producing these cigarettes that were cut, rolled, pasted, ready to go in this fashion. So you could smoke them on your way to your factory job. You could smoke them on the job. So they were ready-made, they were mass-produced. James Duke created some of the very first national brands of cigarettes under his banner, the American Tobacco Corporation. Many of those brands still being sold to this day. James Duke, as a result, became extremely wealthy, so wealthy that he endowed a university that bears his name, and if you're a fan of college basketball, you're probably aware of that university because they tend to do pretty well every year in the NCAA tournament. So that's one example of how his legacy continues to this day, but his legacy, of course, is a product, again, of factories, railroads, the new industrial economy. But it's an example of how those trends affected people, again, on the intimate human level, again, in what they put inside their mouths. So Duke's story, like Swift's story, is a story of how industrialization affected people on the intimate human level. Swift changed our diet in a way we could still recognize today. And Duke changed our daily lives as, up until very, very recently, America was a nation of smokers. We may still remain a nation of meat eaters, enjoying our bacon pastrami disaster burgers, but up until very, very recently, we were also a nation of smokers. Now, many of you are probably too young to know this or remember this, but it wasn't too long ago where smoking was part of everyday life in America, where in college classrooms there would be ashtrays on the seminar tables. Today, of course, it's not the case. Cigarette smoking is seen as a scourge in American life. We treat smokers as pariahs. We're constantly taxing cigarettes. There's always support for that. We create these little smokers concentration camps wherever in public space you're still allowed to smoke. If anyone dares to light up a cigarette, instantly people start waving their arms and calling for some sort of intervention of sorts. We pass laws that say you can't smoke at the beach. It's just one big goddamn ashtray, but heaven forbid you smoke there. We pass laws that say you can't smoke in a bar. Why do people go to bars? To drink poison and solicit unprotected sex, but heaven forbid you do something unhealthy there, like smoke a cigarette, right? So we've all become self-righteous as, we munch down on our bacon pastrami disaster burgers and freak out if someone lights up a cigarette. But all of that, our anti-smoking sensibility that prevails today, that has made smokers such pariahs very, very recently. It's only in the last few decades that has developed, and a lot of it, again, is the legacy of James Duke. One last example of how industrialization, this new economy of the Gilded Age, affected people on the intimate, personal, human level and what they put inside their bodies. John Arbuckle, who mass-produced coffee. He invented a machine that could mass roast, grind, and package coffee. Now, we all have our vices, and you may have intimated from my comments a moment ago about smokers that I'm sort of welcoming to people's vices, even if I do not share those vices, but I have my own vices. Every day when I wake up, I instantly start doing drugs. Now, after a few lectures with me, you're probably not surprised. You probably already concluded that guy's got to be on something, but my drug is a legal drug. It is caffeine. And for those like me who are addicted to caffeine, John Arbuckle is our master, our patron saint, because he brought coffee to the masses. He did for coffee what Swift did for meat and what Duke did for tobacco. Prior to Swift's efforts, meat was again expensive, the province of the wealthy. Prior to Duke's efforts, tobacco also was a treat for the wealthy. John Arbuckle did that for coffee, which also was prohibitively expensive for most working class Americans in the 19th century, but using his methodologies, using his scale of production, using new means of mass producing and creating a ready-made product that had already been ground and was ready to use, Arbuckle brought coffee to the masses. He created the very first national brand of coffee, Ariosa, which soon would be competed with here on the West Coast by Folgers Coffee. And so again, his story is a story of industrialization. It's a story of mass production. It's a story of national brands, national markets, all those trends we talked about on our first slide. But it is an example of how those trends affected people on the intimate human level. Americans living through the Gilded Age lived through a period of technological and economic transformation that, again, is very analogous to the way in which we, in the 21st century, have lived through a period of economic and technological transformation. They, as we, experience those trends on the intimate human level. So we've begun this lecture by talking about economic, technological, social trends in the Gilded Age as key abiding characteristics of this period. Another key abiding characteristic of this period is a growing divide, a growing cleavage in American society between a few who are very rich, the haves, and the many who were on the underside of the American economy, the have-nots. In this period, titans of industry emerge, commanders of industry who, again, often controlled big business, big corporations that owned land around the nation, eventually around the world, were selling products on a national scale. Those include Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, Leland Stanford. These are the titans of industry often associated with the Gilded Age. Andrew Carnegie was an immigrant from Scotland. He brought the Bessemer process of producing steel to the United States. He centered his production in Pennsylvania, making it, at least Pittsburgh in particular, Steel City, USA for many, many, many decades to come, hence the football team in Pittsburgh. He helped create what was really the lifeblood in many ways of the new industrial age, steel. So many products of this period would be made out of steel. The skyscrapers that pierced the skyline of New York City in the 1880s were only possible thanks to this innovation. Prior to steel, most metal products were made of iron. Iron is a soft metal. It's not a particularly strong metal. Steel is lighter than iron, yet stronger, so it was the perfect material for this new industrial age, and so many of the industrial gadgets and gizmos for the next 100 years before the advent and widespread use of plastics would be made from steel. And Andrew Carnegie was at the heart of that. You may be familiar with his last name because he made so much money. He spent the rest of his life giving it away. And so you're probably familiar with things like Carnegie Hall. If you're a real nerd or dork like me and spend all of your time watching PBS, you've probably seen many programs on PBS that begin with a quick statement, "This boring history program brought to you from a grant from the Carnegie Foundation," right? So Carnegie still lives on in our public culture. The Carnegie Endowment still funds a variety of intellectual and cultural projects in America, meaning the money he made in the Gilded Age is still being employed here in the early 21st century. On the right, you have John D. Rockefeller, who made his money in the oil industry. He was really at the fulcrum point, the hinge point, when oil went from something used for illumination, something used to illuminate the home prior to the widespread availability of electricity, to eventually the other lifeblood in many ways of the industrial age, gasoline and oil used in internal combustion engines. Rockefeller made his fortune in that transition and became the very first billionaire in American history in the early 20th century. Rockefeller was so associated with wealth that for a long time in the American vocabulary, if you wanted to call someone rich, you called him a Rockefeller. Oh, he's a real Rockefeller. Look at all the money he has. Today, you might call someone a real Gates or Bezos. But for a long time, his name was an adjective in American common parlance for someone very, very rich. And so Rockefeller became the first billionaire in American history. He profited from his control of Standard Oil, which at one point controlled 96% of all oil production in the United States. His name too lives on, Rockefeller Center, and many other examples of his name. For a long time, his descendants were very powerful and active in American politics. So here are two examples of the haves. Carnegie, Rockefeller, these titans of industry, multimillionaires, eventually billionaires, and to some extent you can learn a little bit about the Gilded Age by examining this side of the American society, the haves. But what about the have-nots? What about the people who worked for Carnegie and Rockefeller? Let's turn our attention to them to offer a more fully fleshed picture into the Gilded Age. One group who clearly stands as have-nots in this period, people who do not have wealth, capital, economic stability, the workers who are now finding themselves living in cities, working in factories, swept up in those trends that we've been talking so much about in this lecture. Their lives were marked by poverty, a very unstable economic order and the boom and bust economy of the Gilded Age. In good times, they would be able to find work for little pay in hazardous, dangerous jobs. Now, in the Gilded Age, there's no such thing as mandatory safety protocols and procedures. There's no government body like OSHA inspecting workplaces. It was very common in this period for people to lose an arm, a leg, an eye on the factory floor. It's very common for people to be killed on the factory floor. This is a period without any regulation in regards to workplace safety. It's a period without things like workers' compensation laws, so that if you do lose an arm, a leg, an eye, that there's some compensation for you. If you were injured on the job in this period, you first suffered the misery of being injured, but then you were punished twice because you'd be fired as you were no longer of use to the factory owner, and so you'd spend the rest of your life impoverished because you couldn't work to support yourself and you received no compensation. So in good times, when things are good, people find themselves working for a pittance. They found themselves, even though they were working 6 days a week, which was the norm in this period, chronically impoverished, chronically indebted, and their jobs were dangerous. They faced constant fear of losing an arm, a leg, an eye, losing their lives, being unable to support themselves, their families. There's no safety net of any sort in this period, no workers' compensation laws, very few have access to retirement or pensions, miserable times. And then there are the bad times. If that's the good times, the bad times were the many depressions, the economic downturns of the Gilded Age. This is a period of a very volatile economy. As America transitioned into industrialization, as America went through this very abrupt process of transitioning from an industrial economy to a rural farm-based economy, the economy was very unsteady. And so you have panics in this period, like the panic of 1873, the Panic of 1893. Today, when our economy takes a downturn, we use these very clinical terms like recession, depression. Our economy's depressed. It just doesn't feel good today, right? Well, in the 19th century, they were much more honest about these economic downturns. They called them panics because everyone friggin' panicked, right? So you have these panics throughout the 19th century as America in fits and starts in a very unsteady and often chaotic way transitioned to an industrial economy. And that meant factories closed, widespread unemployment, people lost their homes, foreclosures, all the things we associate with economic downturns that we may describe as recessions or depressions today. So in good times, you had a miserable job where you were constantly in fear that you were going to be maimed or killed that didn't pay you enough to pay the bills. And then in bad times, you couldn't even get that job because you had this very boom and bust economy, this very unstable economy, and people lost their jobs, unemployment, they found themselves evicted, foreclosed upon. So this too made the industrial workers of this period, the people crowding into cities, the people competing in this new economy, trying to sell their time for money. In the new age of wage labor, it clearly made them have-nots. The 60-hour work week was very common. Again, people work 6 days a week, often without breaks. The weekend that we all look forward to is a very, 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 very modern invention. It isn't until after World War II, after 1945, that most Americans will only work 5 days a week. In this period, the 6-day work week was expected, the norm, and you might work a 10, 12-hour shift during those 6 days without a break. So we're talking about a 60-hour work week, no safety net whatsoever, no pensions, nobody retires in this period. Retirement, too, is to some extent a rather recent development in the last few decades of American history, where there's this moment in your life where you no longer had to work. You don't really get that until the 20th century with programs like Social Security and the union movements of the mid-20th century. And this period is very common for people to work until they physically could not do it any longer. And this period is very common in the Gilded Age for people to die on the factory floor, so they worked until their very dying moment. They don't have a retirement. They don't spend time, with their pants up to their nipples and dark socks up to their knees playing shuffleboard. That doesn't happen for most Americans in this period. During the economic downturns, the panics where people lost their jobs, there's no such thing as unemployment insurance. That too will not be created until the New Deal era in the 20th century in response to the Great Depression. So there's no safety net, no Social Security, no retirement. In this period, the family income was the rule where all members of the family worked. There are no child labor laws in this period. There are not effective child labor laws enforced in America, again, until the early 1900s, the early 20th century. There are no compulsory education laws in this period that require you to send your kid to school rather than to work. And so this is a period where children worked. Very common to see 5, 6-year-olds on the factory floor working right alongside adults. This was done because children were often preferred by industrialists as a labor source, because they could be paid so little, because they were imagined to be more obedient, more tractable than adults, more likely to listen to adults. Not my children, but these children evidently. And their little arms were good for reaching into machines and pulling bolts and parts that had fallen off. Hey, little Timmy, stick your arm to that clattering machine. So children were often tasked with the most dangerous jobs because their little bodies were more conducive to such tasks on the factory floor. So without child labor laws, without compulsory education laws, it was very common to see children working on the factory floor. Industrialists may have liked this because they could pay children so little, because they imagined children would be more obedient and tractable. But this was also very common in America because parents needed their children on the factory floor. They don't send them to school not because they don't realize, hey, education's a great thing and we want little Timmy and little Sally to have an education. They do it because they have to. They needed the wages that came in with their children to pay the rent, put food on the table, and eke out a bare and desperate existence. So this is a period where children worked, where, again, the elderly worked. It's what's known as a family income, where all members of the family are expected to contribute. All members of the family are expected to work and earn wages. Why? To simply meet bare existence, to put food on the table. This is a period where, again, jobs were very dangerous with no workplace safety measures in place, where workers were often killed on the factory floor. We have a statistic here on the slide to bear that out. Between 1880 and the end of the 20th century, 35,000 workers died on the job each and every year. That's not a cumulative figure for that 20-year span. That's every year 35,000 people are dying on the factory floor. So multiply it by 20 to give a figure for that period. Startling information, startling evidence of how dangerous this was. And of course, many people didn't die, but they did lose an arm, a leg, an eye, and on top of that were punished all over again by being fired. So if one of the abiding characteristics of the Gilded Age is that it's a period of a growing divide between haves and have-nots, there are the Carnegies, there are the Rockefellers, the Leland Stanfords of this period, and then there are the people who worked for them, the industrial workers, the people who find themselves living in cities, working in factories. They are the have-nots of American society in this period. They find themselves on the underside of the American dream because they are being paid so poorly, because they're working in such dangerous jobs. They're subject to chronic indebtedness. In good times and bad times, they lose their jobs. There's no safety net, no hope of retirement. You're going to work to your dying day. You have to send your child to the factory floor and fear for their safety. So by every measure, industrial workers, the people who are the labor of industrial America, clearly have-nots in this Gilded Age society of haves and have-nots. When we're talking about the have-nots of America in the Gilded Age, we're talking about this great disparity in wealth that exists between the very few, the titans of industry, and the people whose labor helps make them so rich, the industrial workers. So that's really this dynamic of haves and have-nots. What's separating the two is this very growing disparity between the income of a few, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, and the many, the industrial workers who work for the Carnegies and Rockefellers. We have a good sense of the daily lives of these industrial workers, these have-nots, suffering on the underside of this great disparity in wealth, thanks to the efforts of Jacob Riis, who in 1890 published a book called How the Other Half Lives, the title of this slide. This was an expose of what Riis saw when he went into the homes of industrial workers living in New York in the 1880s. He did these studies. He wrote a series of essays describing what he saw. He took photographs and then published this in a landmark work in 1890, How the Other Half Lives. Jacob Riis was a journalist. He was a muckraker journalist. This is the term used to describe journalists like him that wanted to create a social argument dialogue about the costs of this great disparity in wealth. He was a muckraker journalist, a group of journalists who went around and sought to expose the inequities in American life, the images that were often unseen in an America that in the Gilded Age tended to focus on the haves and not see the have-nots. Muckraker, this term, was used to describe such journalists. It's the idea of raking up the muck, exposing what is below. And Riis and many others fit that description. In 1890, he raked up the muck and exposed how the other half lives. Again, a good part of this book consists of essays that Riis wrote, where he would describe the dwellings, the homes of the industrial workers living in New York City in this time of industrialization and urbanization. But the most powerful element of this book, the photographs. One of the values of How the Other Half Lives is that it can still be drawn upon to this day by historians as a window into what New York was like in the Gilded Age, in the 1880s. It is this repository of images. Riis took these photographs because he knew that describing these conditions could only communicate so much, that actually seeing them with one's eyes would be much more startling and arresting. Remember, Rees and muckrakers want to be provocative. They want to instigate a larger argument and debate. And so he really wanted to shock the nation. And the best way to shock the nation was by taking photographs like the one you see here of this dilapidated tenement building. Rees took many photographs. He took photographs of children sleeping in the streets of New York, exhausted after a 12-hour workday. Here's this child sleeping on the streets of New York, not in a classroom. So he took photographs. He took photographs of how the other half lives. He exposed how they lived. He documented the tenement buildings that were the common dwellings of industrial workers in this period. Tenement buildings were often big, gutted-out factories that had no longer use as factories, and then they would create little apartments for people to live in. They often lacked electricity, heat, which is a huge problem in New York City in the winter, and they lacked indoor plumbing. So there was obviously a human problem about what to do with one's pee-pee and poo-poo. New York City was full of filth and squalor in this period. There's no sanitation service, no sewage service. People piled up their trash everywhere. Wild animals roamed the streets of New York, subsisting on the trash that was there. Just a den of squalor. That's why epidemics were so common in this period. Cholera, tuberculosis would spread like wildfire. So this is the life of a have-not industrial worker. You work a 12-hour shift on the factory floor, constantly in fear you're going to lose your life in such dangerous conditions. Your reward for this is poverty wages that keep you forever impoverished and indebted. And then you go home to filth and squalor and likely death from an epidemic. This was what Jacob Riis sought to expose in his book, How the Other Half Lives, and spark a debate about whether this was just and right and fair, whether this great disparity in wealth that defines the Gilded Age, where a few are very rich and the people who labor for them, whose labor makes them so wealthy, live in filth and squalor. In our next lecture, we're going to talk about this debate about the inequities and excesses of the Gilded Age, a debate that ripples through America in the decades that follow the Gilded Age in the Progressive era. Riis, muckrakers like him, crusaders who wanted to address this great disparity in wealth, address the injustice, inequities, and human miseries that come along with it, would launch efforts in the decades that follow the Gilded Age that sought to engender progress, arguing that this is not just, it's not fair, and that we in America can do something about this. And so in a lecture to come soon, we'll talk about the Progressive era, the next period in American history after the Gilded Age, and how that period was really driven by a sense of outrage that came from the efforts of Riis and muckrakers like him, that for us as historians, as history students, really offer us a great window into what it was like to be a have-not in this Gilded Age society of haves and have-nots. By every measure, industrial workers are have-nots in this have and have-not dynamic that defines the Gilded Age. They are impoverished. They are facing chronic indebtedness. They also face lives of hazard where their very bodies are imperiled just to make the rent and keep food on the table. So hopefully after a few slides now, you have a good appreciation for how these industrial workers fit our definition of have-nots. But another group of Americans who also fit this definition, Native Americans. As I mentioned in our very first slides, in the Gilded Age, America fully industrializes. That means all parts of the American nation are now subject to this new industrial economy, north and south, east and west. And this is a period where the West is rapidly undergoing a process of industrial transformation as industries like railroading, mining, ranching, commercial farming transform the West. The Civil War was in many ways about the future of America, a future assumed to be unveiled in the West, a future that would be either slave labor or wage labor. Well, again, the North wins the Civil War, slavery is abolished, and that meant now wage labor would be the prevailing system in the West. And after the Civil War and Reconstruction period, this process of industrializing the West took off like wildfire, growing exponentially. And as a result of that, Native Americans faced this full-on onslaught that was determined to wrest them of their land, and with it their freedom and autonomy. Native Americans are have-nots in the story of the industrialization of the West, where there's this full-throated effort by the American government, by corporations, by American citizens, to divest Native Americans of their land, making them certainly have-nots who lose their land, but also divest them of their ability to live as they see fit upon that land, retain their culture, their traditions, their languages. Even during the Civil War, even when the North is losing every major battle, Abraham Lincoln still finds enough troops to head out west and war against Native Americans. So though the Civil War was in many ways about the West, the future of the West, even while that war was going on, the U.S. government continued to prosecute its efforts to displace Native Americans and wrest control of land in the West. You had the Homestead Act, an act of Congress in the Civil War that granted to American citizens land in the West, land that was deliberately appropriated from Native Americans through wars of aggression that began before the Civil War and continued during the Civil War and then accelerate after the Civil War, when in the Gilded Age there's this, again, full-throated, concerted effort by the U.S. government using its coercive power, the U.S. Army, to force Native Americans, particularly in the Plains region, but also in the Northwest, in the Southwest, onto reservations to wrest control over land and sell that land to railroad companies, mining operations, corporations who will industrialize the West. So this is, again, what makes Native Americans have-nots in the society of have and have-nots that defines the Gilded Age. They are far removed from New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, the hotbeds of industrialization in this period. But still, Native Americans in this very different part of the country, in the West, are subject to the forces of industrialization that make them too have-nots, losing their land and their freedom and autonomy. Efforts to divest Native Americans of their autonomy, efforts to force them onto reservations, efforts to work against their resistance to those efforts by the U.S. government, target for the Plains Indians their source of subsistence, the buffalo. It was common in the Gilded Age for railroad companies to sell tickets to men who would ride in railroad cars and lean out the window of railroad cars and shoot every buffalo they saw. People would buy a ticket, take their guns on the train, and then roll through this region in the Plains region of the American West and simply fire upon and kill every buffalo they saw. When a buffalo was killed, they didn't stop the train and harvest the meat and the fur. They just kept rolling on, because the goal of this wasn't to kill buffalo for meat or commodification. The goal was to kill buffalo to kill Native American resistance. If we kill all the buffaloes, we kill the ability of Native Americans to feed themselves. Buffalo, for many Native American tribes, were more than just a source of meat and subsistence. They had religious and cultural significance. So again, if we kill the buffalo, we kill that source of meaning for Native Americans. And so you had this obscene sight of people firing out of railroad windows, killing every buffalo they saw. This is the original drive-by, I guess we could say. Here, killing buffalo to kill Native American independence, to kill Native American resistance, to force them onto reservations. Reservation policy became the official policy embraced by The U.S. government, enforced by the U.S. military. These are the Indian Wars of the 1870s and 1880s, campaigns against the Sioux, the Lakota, campaigns against the Apache and Comanche in the Southwest, against the Nez Perce in the Pacific Northwest, efforts to force them off their ancestral lands to make way for industrialization so that land could be sold to railroad companies, mining operations, as America industrializes north and south, east and west. Native Americans were deemed to be in the way of that process, and they were forced onto reservations. Now, of course, Native Americans fought back, and they resisted that effort. These are wars, and in some battles, they were able to win quick victories, perhaps the most famous, the Battle of Little Bighorn, where a Civil War veteran, George Custer, is killed by Native Americans who were fighting again for their land, their freedom, their independence. This would later be commemorated in movies, Hollywood films. They died with their boots on, which inverted in many ways the morality here and made Custer and others the victims, and urged audiences to feel sympathy with them, even though they were again fighting to force Native Americans onto reservations. Though there would be those victories for Native Americans, they are few and far between. And with this full-throated and concerted effort of the U.S. government, the U.S. military, corporations, American citizens, it became harder and harder for Native Americans to resist. And in 1890, you have the last confrontation between the U.S. Army and Native Americans, the massacre at Wounded Knee, where Native Americans who were attempting to prevent being forced onto reservations would be massacred by the U.S. military, using violence, using these coercive measures to force Native Americans off their land for the cause of industrialization. The Native Americans who were massacred at Wounded Knee were not only attempting to resist that process of reservation enforcement militarily, they were also recommitting to their religiosity, to their traditions. They often exhibited what was known as the ghost dance, which was this performance of their religiosity, but also performance of defiance. So we'll talk about in a moment. It's very common this period for Christian missionaries to go out to Native American land and attempt to convert Native Americans to Christianity, to stamp out not just their independence, their autonomy, but their religion. Christian missionaries who saw themselves as do-gooders, who saw themselves as agents of civilization, who were there to convert Native Americans to what they imagined to be the one true faith, launched their own onslaught of cultural imperialism against Native Americans. And so the ghost dance was a rejection of that, a defiant act that demonstrated the intense religiosity of Native Americans. Unfortunately, though, Native Americans were massacred at Wounded Knee, and soon after, in 1890, the U.S. government declared the frontier closed. There's an official proclamation from the U.S. government in 1890, the frontier is now closed, meaning we have forced all Native Americans onto reservations. Those who resisted were either pacified, defeated, or killed. The leaders of Native American resistance, men like Chief Joseph and others, were eventually captured by the U.S. government. And so the U.S. government could confidently say, frontiers closed, mission accomplished. We have forced all Native Americans onto reservations. We have stamped out this resistance. We have consolidated our control over the West. So Native Americans are have-nots in that they're losing their land and again losing their autonomy, their independence. They too are on the underside of this American dream, much like industrial workers that we examined in previous slides. Once captive on reservations, this effort did not stop because the U.S. government attempted to remake Native American life. Once Native Americans were forced onto reservations, they were still subject to this process of cultural imperialism, cultural intervention. They were forced onto reservations to make way for railroads, mining operations, but then captive there, they would be subject to forms of cultural intervention that were designed to change and transform Native American life. There was this belief behind the architects of this policy and the promulgators of this policy that the problem with Native Americans was that they are uncivilized. And there was this notion accompanying that of what it meant to be civilized. Civilized in the eyes of the Indian agents, the Christian missionaries, and the U.S. government in this period was defined as being Christian, speaking English, embracing capitalism, private property, and exhibiting what were imagined to be proper gender roles of patriarchy. And so while Native Americans are forced onto reservations, here come all of these government officials, Christian missionaries, teachers who would be employed at schools established for Native Americans who prosecute this effort to stamp out Native American tradition, belief, and to turn Native Americans into good little private property owners, people who speak English and worship Christ. So you're forced on a reservation, you're divested of your land, you're facing this onslaught designed to deprive you of your traditions, and then Ned Flanders shows up, and he's there to bring you into what he imagines to be the true faith. And so it's very common this period for Christian missionaries to head out west, all with this belief that Native Americans are the problem, that they are uncivilized and we need to make them civilized. Capper to this was federal legislation passed in 1887 known as the Dawes Act. And the slide here takes the very language of the Dawes Act. You see this in quotation marks saying, adopt the habits of civilized life. That phrase, with the quotation marks as your cue, comes right from the Dawes Act. And it states, again, that this is an effort to encourage Native Americans to, quote, adopt the habits of civilized life. Well, what does it mean to be civilized? In the minds of the legislatures who wrote this and passed it, it meant to speak English, to worship Christ, and most importantly for them, to be good little private property owners. That's what it means to be civilized. As part of that, in the Dawes Act, land on reservations was carved up and parceled out to Native Americans in an effort to make them private property owners in defiance of traditions in Native American culture where land was often seen as a communal resource. One individual can't own the land. How could a piece of paper, a deed, declare that I and only I own land? Well, in defiance of that, there's this effort to urge Native Americans to embrace the virtues of private property because, again, the architects of this policy, the people behind it, believe that good civilized people are private property owners who cultivate land for their own private profit. So as part of this effort to convert to Christianity, urge English only, to impose Victorian gender roles, which were deeply committed to patriarchy and male-dominated societies and male-dominated tribal affairs. There was also this effort in the Dawes Act to make Native Americans good little private property owners. But what happens is that when they carve up reservations and they give every male member of the Native American tribe his little plot of land and say, presto, now you're a private property owner and you'll see how great it is to be civilized in this fashion, there's a lot of land left over, and the U.S. government just turns around and sells that land to railroad companies, mining operations, corporations. In this period, there's no income tax. The main way of funding the federal government was through land sales, land that had been taken, appropriated from Native Americans, and then turned around and sold to private investors, real estate speculators, railroad companies, mining operations. So Native Americans already lost land when they were forced onto reservations, and then they further lost land because under the Dawes Act, they parcel out the land. Whatever land isn't parceled out to Native Americans is turned around, appropriated by the U.S. government, and sold to corporations in this way. The Dawes Act was a huge disaster for Native Americans. They lost hundreds of thousands of acres of land on top of all the land they had already lost since, 1492. And the irony of this, the tragedy more accurately of this, the people who wrote the Dawes Act thought they were doing the right thing. There were many Americans in this period, public figures, newspaper editorials that said we shouldn't even do this for Native Americans. We should just kill them all. They are irredeemable. People behind the Dawes Act believed Native Americans could be saved, could be redeemed if we just urged them to, again, quote, adopt the habits of civilized life. So on the range of opinions regarding Native Americans, The authors of the Dawes Act were the nice guys because they actually believed that Native Americans could be civilized in this fashion. The people who wrote the Dawes Act thought they were doing the right thing. There were Native American advocacy groups in this period founded by whites with names like the Friends of the Indians. If someone tells you that they're your friend, run. That's a bad sign, right? No one tells you, hi, I'm your friend, I'm here to help. If you hear that, run immediately, right? You get to determine your own friends. But these are people who said, oh, we're the Friends of the Indians. We're advocates because, the problem with Indians, they need to learn English, they need to learn Christianity. And so the irony, the tragedy of this is that the people behind it actually thought they were doing the right thing. It's a lesson, and history offers many, of the problems of good intentions. All right, this has been a rather bleak and dismal story so far. I mean, what have you learned about here in this lecture? People dying on the factory floor, children falling asleep in the streets of New York City because they're exhausted, cholera outbreaks, Native Americans facing this onslaught. And so the Gilded Age, not a particularly happy period, particularly for the majority of Americans who are the have-nots. In our previous lecture on Reconstruction, we learned about the fate of African Americans in the South after the Civil War, how they were denied basic political rights that should be guaranteed under the 14th and 15th Amendments, how they were locked in this debilitating cycle of poverty and indebtedness known as sharecropping, how they faced racialized violence with the rise of groups like the Klan. So after these last two lectures, it's a pretty dark and bleak scene wherever you look in America, north or south, east or west, a nation of have-nots. And it begs the question, how did Americans make sense of this? How did Americans come to interpret, reconcile this very bleak scene? And that brings us to the last element of the Gilded Age I want to include in this lecture, an answer to that question of how Americans came to make sense of these great disparities in wealth, of this rather bleak and miserable scene that we've now illuminated over the course of our last two lectures. An ideology develops in the Gilded Age known as social Darwinism, and it ultimately serve to justify, sanction, even uplift this world of haves and have-nots. Social Darwinists and people who embrace this ideology looked at all that we have now described over the last two lectures and say, it's great, it's the way things should be. So the linchpin, the thing that ties everything together now, social Darwinism, it is what answers the question we posed at the very beginning of the slide. How did Americans come to terms with this? How did Americans accept a world where a few are so rich and the many are so desperately poor? The answer to that was social Darwinism, which was an ideology that became a mania in this period. And as we'll talk about over the course of the next two slides, spread throughout America, infecting and influencing millions and convincing them that this is the way things should be. Social Darwinism was an ideology that came out of the social sciences, new fields of knowledge that appear in this age, anthropology, sociology. Now, you might think those fields of knowledge have been around forever. Actually, no. They are new fields of knowledge that appear for the first time in the late 19th century, during a period where science is celebrated as a barometer, measure of truth. In the Gilded Age, you had new inventions like telephones and automobiles, skyscrapers, piercing the skyline. Eventually, by the late 19th century, you'll see things like motion pictures, the ability to capture and project motion. The nation was awash in these modern miracles that now were transforming everyday life, and as a result, people saw science as magical, powerful. Also in this period, people saw science as having revelatory power, as a measure, arbiter of truth, as something that could not just transform material life, but answer fundamentally, without God or the supernatural, the questions of humanity, of who we are, where we came from, how we should behave. Science offered itself as an answer to those questions. It offered itself as an answer without relying on the supernatural, religion, God. It offered itself as a measure of truth. And out of science, in particular social sciences, came this way of thinking, social Darwinism, that took the theories of Charles Darwin and applied them inappropriately, wrong-headedly, to modern American life. Social sciences were an effort to take science and apply it to society. So it's late in the lecture, you don't have to work too hard here. It's a pretty easy concept to understand. Social sciences, as the name indicates, take science, apply it to the social, apply it to society. What happens is that anthropologists, sociologists, people in the rechristened field of political science take Darwin's theories about evolution, adaptation, selectivity, and apply them inappropriately to modern American life. Now, Darwin published in 1859 his landmark work, Origin of the Species, which offered his explanation of the origins of life here on Earth. In doing so, he talked about a long process that played out over billions of years. In doing so, he mostly focused on the natural world, finches and tortoises. But what happens is that social scientists, so eager to harness science and apply it to society, take Darwin's theories about the natural world and apply them to modern human beings. Take Darwin's theories about a slow evolutionary process that plays out over billions of years and falsely, inappropriately, unscientifically apply it to modern American life, arguing that, well, we're living through a period of remarkable evolution as we transition from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, as we find ourselves awash in new forms of technology. As a result, it's up to you to adapt to that change. Some will be selected out from the great variety to succeed, advance. Others will be left behind. And all of this is progress. That's social Darwinism. That's taking Darwin's theories and falsely, unscientifically, inappropriately applying them to modern American life to justify racism, to justify nativism, fear and hatred of foreigners, to justify a great disparity in wealth, to argue, well, it's survival of the fittest. Now, this phrase you're probably familiar with and associate with Darwin, but it was actually popularized not by Charles Darwin himself, but by social Darwinists. The ubiquity of this phrase, the way in which most Americans know of Darwin in relation to this phrase, testifies not to the power of Charles Darwin, but actually the power of social Darwinists, because they were much more skilled and successful in advancing this phrase, survival of the fittest. This idea that America is divided into the fit and the unfit. Some will adapt to a changing economy, changing environment, and they will succeed and advance. Others, well, they can't adapt. They're the unfit. Now, I want to stress to you, there is nothing scientific about social Darwinism. In fact, there's nothing really Darwin about social Darwinism. Again, Darwin was talking about billions of years. He was talking about a slow process. He was talking about animals, not modern human beings living in an age of railroads and skyscrapers and telephones. So do not confuse social Darwinism with actual science. It is a false science. It is a pseudoscience. It has been thoroughly discredited. But in this period where people thought it was scientific, because it claimed to be rooted in Darwin's theories, in this age where people place great faith in science as a measure of truth, social Darwinism could become an ideology that would claim to be truthful and scientific and be used to justify racism, justify wars of aggression against Native Americans, efforts to terrorize African Americans, deny them their equality, could justify a world where a few are very rich and the many are desperately poor by arguing it's just survival of the fittest. And in that sense, social Darwinism becomes this glue, this missing element now introduced here that will serve to justify and sanction a world of haves and have-nots. And social Darwinism becomes dominant, prevalent, ubiquitous in America, thanks to the efforts of many popularizers who brought this way of thinking to the masses and convinced them, well, It's merely survival of the fittest. Some are more fit than others. One great popularizer of social Darwinism, William Graham Sumner, who was a professor at times at Harvard, Yale, taught at many different prominent universities, trained the wealthy elite who were inclined towards social Darwinism because it said they're the fit, they're so great. But Sumner reached people well beyond the university. He was a very skilled orator, a very charismatic speaker. In the 1880s, this is a period without television, without radio, without cinema, without the internet, and all the wonders that amuse us today. I mean, what did people do for fun then if there's no radio, television, internet? I mean, what did people do before these TV shows you guys are all watching, Dancing with the Idiots, America's Got Herpes? What did people do before they were able to watch videos of men on skateboards drinking cranberry juice, right? Well, one thing that people might do in this period prior to modern media was to go and watch a lecture. Believe it or not, people once paid for lectures. Okay, well, maybe you can believe this, right? Sumner was a very skilled orator. He was a very skilled speaker, and people would pay to go and hear him lecture. He also wrote books for the masses. He wrote the sort of books professors write with lots of jargon and charts and footnotes, books that nobody reads. But he also wrote books for the masses that articulated social Darwinism and helped to make it a dominant, prevalent idea. His most famous work was What the Social Classes Owe Each Other. And it was a great title because it just basically introduced the entire concept of the book. If you want to sell books, have a very clear, lucid title that just tells you what the book's all about so people don't actually have to read the book. What the Social Classes Owe Each Other is such a title, and it really encapsulates, therefore, the totality of the book. What was his argument in this book? Well, the rich owe the poor nothing. The rich have proven themselves to be superior, and they owe the poor nothing. This is a period where there's no income tax, no inheritance tax. Wealthy people who make $1 million a year keep every penny. And Sumner said, that's great. We should not tax from the fit and give it to the unfit. So the rich owe the poor nothing. The flip side to this, the poor owe the rich everything. The poor should be happy that rich people are so rich. They should get down on their knees every day and thank the rich for being so rich. Why? Well, Sumner argued they provide a model of success. They're a walking, talking exemplar of success. And therefore, they offer to the poor a model of how to go from rags to riches to succeed. And so you should be happy that rich people are so rich because they provide a model for success. And therefore, it's up to you. Can you adapt to that model? Can you follow that? If you can, well, you too will be rich. If you can't, it's your own damn fault. The poor owe the rich nothing. In this period, the abiding political philosophy was laissez-faire, a period where both parties, the Democratic Party and Republican Party, argued government should stay out of society, stay out of the economy. It's a period where there are no income or inheritance taxes, again, no workplace compensation, no unemployment insurance, no regulation of industrial workplaces, no child labor laws, and that political philosophy known as laissez-faire that argued for a hands-off government in the economy, complemented social Darwinism because social Darwinism said it's just simply survival of the fittest. Don't intervene. Don't try to tax the rich to pay for schools and hospitals and programs to advance the interest of poor people. No, just simply allow Darwinian competition to play out. So you had the political class in America, both major parties, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, embracing this idea of laissez-faire. This idea the government should stay out of the economy, simply allow Darwinian forces to prevail. Also evidence of the prevalence and popularity of social Darwinism, this way of thinking that again provides the lifeblood, the ideology that makes the Gilded Age possible. But social Darwinism wasn't just for the political class, the professors, the middle class who would read Sumner's book or attend his lectures. The ideology even permeated and reached the poorest Americans and convinced them of survival of the fittest, convinced them that they're the problem, not the system. They're the problem. Through the pop culture of this period. I mentioned earlier, there are no TV shows, no television in this period, no movies, no radio. The prevailing form of popular culture, mass culture, the culture of the masses, was print culture. That included newspapers, broadsheet newspapers, more about them in lectures to come, and cheap novels printed on repulped paper, the dime novel. Dime novel was a novel that, can you believe it? Yeah, hard to believe. Cost 10 cents, right? So a pretty easy concept to understand. And that meant that even the poorest American, poor industrial worker, eking out a desperate living, an immigrant, even a sharecropper, would have a few dime novels in his roughly hewn dwelling. The most popular writer of dime novels in the Gilded Age was Horatio Alger, and though he wrote many stories, it was pretty much the same story over and over. It was very formulaic, and a lot of pop culture tends to be formulaic in that way, giving you the same thing over and over again, like a sitcom today. Any American sitcom, right? The dad's a fat idiot. Mom is far too hot for him, but also smart, and the whole reason the house doesn't burn down every week. And the kids are all smart asses, right? That's been every American sitcom since the Simpsons set that template. So sitcoms are formulaic. You see the same thing over and over again. Pop culture is often very formulaic. I don't know, has anyone seen a superhero movie, right? It's pretty much the same thing over and over again. And yet they get your $20, or at least they used to. The formula for Horatio Alger and his dime novels was the rags to riches story. The story of a guy who's born poor, but through hard work, thrift, pluck, rises from rags to riches. And this is the story that demonstrates how in mass culture, in popular culture, in the culture consumed by poor Americans, they too were touched and influenced by this idea of social Darwinism. The idea that if you want to advance, you got to work hard, got to show up time, don't complain. The idea that it's all up to you. Rags to riches story. So Horatio Alger, popular writer, sold more novels than the acclaimed writers of this period like Mark Twain and others, trafficked in the rags to riches story. And it is that rags to riches story that brought social Darwinism to the masses and told them they're the problem, not the economy, not the system. They want to go from rags to riches. You got to work hard, got to show up on time. Don't complain. You got to adapt to this new economy, convincing them to accept a world of haves and have-nots. Americans love rags to riches stories, stories of Rocky Balboa getting a chance to fight for the world heavyweight title, stories of people plucked out of obscurity. And it convinces us that the system works, that if you work hard, that if you are skilled, that if you have talent, the world is yours. And it urges us to look away from the corruption, from the problems within the system. And so the rags to riches story convinced Americans they're the problem. It's the way in which social Darwinism reached even the poorest Americans. So social Darwinism we conclude with because it is this last missing element now included, the way of thinking about what you have seen now develop in the 1870s and 1880s. But there are those photographs of Jacob Riis, and there are many Americans who aren't convinced that it's simply a matter of haves and have-nots. It's simply a matter of survival of the fittest. I mentioned earlier that the inequities and excesses of the Gilded Age would lead to a cultural conversation that would spark reform. Reform we'll talk about in our next lecture on the Progressive Era.